Now, after all the theory, let's finally start working with some users to get a feeling for how that works, how we can create and edit users, and most importantly, how we can then, well, work as a user. Because right now we always worked with we have all rights mode turned on. Now we will shrink that down to be in a more realistic environment. Users are created by a user with sufficient permissions with the create user command. You then create a user with a username and a password. And as I mentioned, this user will have a couple of roles, or one role. So at least one role. And then each role will typically contain a bunch of privileges. Now, a user is created on a database. So a user is attached to a database. Now, this does not actually limit the access of the user to that database, even though you might think it does. But this is the database against which the user will have to authenticate. The exact rights the user then has depend on the roles you assign to that user. And even if a user authenticates against the shop database, the user might still have the role to work with all databases that exist in your MongoDB environment. And whilst this sounds strange right now, it is something which will become clearer over the next lectures. And there you will understand why we can assign users to different databases if that doesn't lock down their access. Now, of course, we cannot just create users. If we ever need to, we can also update users. Now, keep in mind, update user here basically means that the administrator updates the user. So, of course, you can use that to, for example, change the password, but you should then tell your user too. So, this is how we create and edit users. Now, let's see that in practice. To see that in practice, let's bring up our Mongo server again with the same command we used in the past, but now I will add --off here. And --off simply means that now you need to authenticate in order to work with that database. Previously, we did not have that setting, and that meant that everyone who connects is allowed to do everything. Well, now this ends. Now if we start a server with that, we have a server that will require users to authenticate. Now, with that server up and running, I switched to a new terminal window. And now if I type Mongo, you might have expected that this fails, but actually we're still able to connect here because there are two different ways of signing in. You can now either sign in with dboff. This is a command which takes a username and a password. But of course, I haven't created any users yet, so this won't work. Or you can indeed also sign in during the connection process. So now I quit my Mongo process. You can add the -u key here or flag, and then add your username and -p for the password, and then try connecting like this. Now, I will show a couple of times throughout the lecture. For now, let's connect to Mongo like this. And there is one problem we'll of course face. Do you know which one it is? The problem we initially face, of course, is that now we connected to a database that requires authentication, and we got no user yet. And indeed, if I type show DBs right now, I see nothing. The same for show collections. I get an error, which basically is a cryptic way of telling me you're not allowed to do that. Now, we got no user, and MongoDB has a special solution for that called the localhost exception. When connecting to your database in this state where you haven't added any users, you are allowed to add one user. And that one user should, of course, be a user who is then allowed to create more users. And to do this, you first of all should switch to the admin database and then run db create user. Now, a user is created by passing a document into this function. The first argument should be user. The value here will be the username, and I will use Max. You can type any name you want. Then, separate by a comma, because it's a new key in that document, you add the pwd, so the password, and that also is a string up to you. Now you also need to add the roles, and for that you add a roles key which holds an array of roles. Now you can add multiple roles in different ways. For now, there's one role you should add, and I'll talk more about the available roles in a second. And the role you should add is the user admin any database role. This is a special built-in role which will grant this user the right to administrate any database in this MongoDB environment. Now, if you hit enter, you should have successfully created that user. Now if you type show DBs, you will suddenly see a different kind of error. Now what you will need to do is you now need to authenticate, and you can do this with the auth command. So type max here if that were your credentials or whatever you did use, and hit enter. Make sure you are in the admin database. So use admin first in case you switch to a different database in between. So then you should be authenticated. And now, after being authenticated, you should be able to run show DBs and show collections, but I got none. But I also get no error anymore. So now we created one user, and we created that user with this special role. Now, before we create more users, let's talk about this special role and which built-in roles exist in general.